Guten Morgen, meine Damen und Herren. That's kind of my tip of the cap to the fact that we're in a foreign language thing, and has nothing to do with foreign language. This is a paper that I worked on with Dr. Harold Miller down at Brigham Young University, and we never published it. So I thought it might be something that was of general interest to the community here. And it also avoids having to talk about any specific data, so you can't pick my data apart. I wanted to open with a gentleman, Carroll, who came up with a model of learning, and he published this in 1963. So we're hearing a lot about the 60s. And I think, just pausing on that for a moment, there is a lot of good work that has not been mined. You heard a little bit of frustration before he had his coffee this morning from Dr. Fletcher. There is a lot of seminal work of very good, very bright people out there who raised some of the core questions, and I think expected those questions to then be acted upon and to be taken forward. And I don't think we've taken them forward some 40, 50 years later. And we'll see where that takes us. His argument, he wrote about how to improve school learning. And his core insight was that learning is intrinsically related to time spent learning. And here's the equation that he actually wrote in his paper. And I want to pause on this for just a moment. It says the degree of learning that a student achieves is a function of the time spent learning relative to the time needed to learn. And you'll notice that this equation has a couple of properties. One is that under the time needed to learn, that probably has a lot of contextual effects to it. The quality of instruction, the teacher, etc. But the time spent learning versus the time needed to learn is simply a fraction, which means that this is going to effectively be a dose variable. And to show you what I mean by that, I'll throw this up. This is a dose response curve. This is used very commonly, for instance, over in medicine. If you have a headache and you want to fix that, you will take some dose of medicine. You need to take the proper dose. If you don't take enough, you don't hit the threshold and nothing happens. If you take too much, well, there's a maximal response here. Beyond that, you're not going to get any better diminishment of headache in that case. And then there's something in between. And this potency is there, and the steepness of this curve is something that can be experimentally determined, just empirically. And it further suggests that there is diminishment at some point. Spending infinite time on the alphabet really wouldn't help most of us in this room. We've already got it, it's already automatic, and we've achieved maximal response, and further time is not useful. And so one of the things about optimization, which I think was another theme that Dr. Fletcher was talking to this morning, would be figuring out and modeling this in such a way as to figure out where do we apply the limited time and resources that we have in the most effective way. How do we get the biggest bang for the buck? And there are some nuances here. Here's a quote from him. One of the bolder hypotheses implicit in the model is that the degree of learning, other things being equal, is a simple function of the amount of time during which the pupil engages actively in learning. Well, I would really kind of pause there for a moment and just say, this is starting to suggest causality, and I'll come back to that, but that's a very important point. Time needed to learn, as I mentioned, is a function of a lot of things. It's critical that he is talking about which the pupil. He doesn't say the classroom. He doesn't say, the category of student. He says the pupil, meaning the individual. So everything that he's talking about has to be evaluated at the level of student, not at classroom. And that's very important. Well, time is not time is not time. Berliner came along and wrote a paper called What's All the Fuss About Instructional Time? And pointed out that there are at least half a dozen versions of time. And when everyone sits down and talks about time, you've got time on task, you've got opportunity to learn, you've got all these different things kind of zinging around out there. And time is not time is not time. So he sat down and said, let's start coming up with a taxonomy for time. And he ended up with something that is called academic learning time. And he defined it in a very rigorous way. And he said there are 4 elements for academic learning time. And let's step through them. First of all, the time that we're talking about has to be instructional. So it's not time getting settled in chairs and taking off jackets and all that sort of stuff. It's time when teaching is actually occurring. The student has to be engaged across the time period in question. It doesn't help if they're texting when the teacher's talking. The instruction has to be appropriate for the student, and the content has to be aligned with outcome measures. That's something that I think Dr. Whitehurst last night also talked about. That whole concept of alignment is very important to this. So this is Berliner's diagram, which I've shamelessly ripped off and expanded beyond the point of lucidity here. So my apologies. But essentially what he's done is he's tried to graphically demonstrate that this is a very small and precise subset of AT, which is allocated time. And then you've got engaged time. You have time spent on things related to outcomes. And it's only the overlap of all of these that count. And then he noted something else that I think is very important for this group here. He said even within this, there's high success, medium success, and low success time. For young children, it has to be high success. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But children frustrate very easily. And so they will shut down, even if all these other things are being provided. They will simply shut down if they're not being successful enough. And you will lose them. And so, well, there's some implications here. Berliner said, ALT is therefore not just time on task, it is time on the right tasks. And unless ALT is affected in some way, there will be no changes in student achievement at all. This is not just a statement, this is the statement about educational research. It suggests that it's not just correlational, it is causal. In fact, it is foundational, it is it undergirds everything else that happens. Well, I don't even know how to really express that and cloak that in words. It's that foundational. And yet, let's go to Lord Kelvin here, because we need an obligatory quote. I often say that when you can measure what you are speaking about and express it in numbers, you know something about it, but when you cannot measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. It may be the beginning of knowledge, but you have scarcely in your thoughts advanced to the state of science. ALT, in many ways, is the concept that is starting to shift education from a great idea to a science. And it's still nascent, but we're getting there. So, if ALT is so important, why have I never heard of it? We talked about the explosion of terms. It's a complex and nuanced definition. I'll get into why here. It's exceedingly difficult to quantify. And all 4 of these criteria need to be simultaneously met. So let's step through them one at a time. And we'll dig in here. So the first one is it has to be instructional. So usually what this means and how we measure this, whether time is instructional, is we heard about the proverbial stopwatchers this morning. They sit in the back and they stopwatch teachers, right? And they try to figure it out. Well, some researchers, Brom and Hermberg, found that teachers' estimates of overall instructional time at the classroom level was accurate. When they were in the back stopwatching and then said to the teachers, about how much time did you spend on reading comprehension? The teacher said, oh, we spent, today I spent, 45 minutes or so. And that pretty much aligned with what they found. But they only noticed about 3% of the individual successes and failures of any given student in the classroom. And they summed it up by saying, teachers had observed the class as a unit. They perceived the learning progress of the collective student, that is an abstract subject composed of the various students in the lesson dialogue. And they appear to stand at the front and kind of flow in responses to what they see as the collective student. Very interesting. So imagine just on this topic, I think we'd probably be okay at the group level when a teacher's teaching. We can actually measure this today with traditional research approaches. But you have to actually be on site to do it for the group. Engagement. Engagement is very difficult. Carol described it this way: spending time means actually spending time on the act of learning. Time is therefore not elapsed time, but the time during which the person is oriented to the learning task and actively engaged in learning. In common parlance, it is the time during which he is paying attention and trying to learn. It's not obvious how to actually operationalize this, right? How many of you have young children and you're sitting there and they're doodling and you say something and you thought they weren't listening and then they come back and say it verbatim back to you? Well, it's kind of hard to know, are people engaged or not? And this is a real problem. And once again, if you imagine a researcher trying to do this in a classroom, you'd have to have 30 clocks going, right? 26 and a half clocks going. And you would, as a child looks out the window, you'd have to run over and stop that clock, and then, but keep everyone else's going. This is difficult to do. On top of that, there is no consensus in the research community about what engagement even really means. We all know it's important. We haven't really operationalized it, and we haven't agreed on a common framework or standard. And so this one continues to be a little bit difficult. It has to be appropriate. Age appropriate is something that's thrown around a lot. I think this really has its roots in Vygotsky. For those of you who remember zone of proximal development, right, ZPD, everyone knows it's important. We need the general concept, for those of you who haven't heard about it, is that a child knows something, you want to scaffold off of that and teach something just a little bit one step away from that, right? Not 2 steps because that's too far, not at the same level because that's boring, but just right in that zone. Well, it requires a researcher who's trying to evaluate academic learning time to know the individual level of all 26 and a half children. And if you don't know that, then you can't argue whether it's academic learning time for that child or not. Well, Gettinger and Zybert came along and said, hey, ALT for young children requires an 80% success rate. And I can tell you from playing card games with kids at home, if they don't win 80% of the time, they're not going to play with dad anymore. And it really is the case. So, well, if you operationalize that, once again, how would you actually do this in the field? That would require a minimum of 5 questions per student in the classroom being asked so that you could find out, do you get an 80% mastery rate? Not very realistic. Finally, the assessment. This one is not so bad in general in terms of saying, does it align? Because people are talking about that now. The problem is that none of our assessments line up. We just, had questions about the grade, for instance, which I'm not familiar with. But, if we have about 13,924 districts, we have at least that many district assessments running around by area, right? That many reading, that many math. I mean, it's insane. And what that would suggest is that when you measure ALT over as a researcher in your classroom and I measure it in mine, we're actually measuring different things. Even if we both think we're doing early literacy ALT, it's not there. And so the portability and the ability to talk amongst ourselves is really undermined. In part, as Elmore points out, you have a superintendent who says this is what we're going to teach in this district, and then you have a teacher closing the door and teaching whatever she wants in her classroom, and that's our ethic of teaching today. She needs to teach what she feels is most important and valuable to those children, but it makes it very, very difficult to compare results. So in summary, it requires analysis at the student level, and everything that we do right now operates at the classroom level. And we talk about means, right? I'm not sure that Carol would allow us to talk about means. We're talking about individual trajectories, and this is a real problem. Well, so we have a problem. Here comes technology. Once again, 1966, we're back in the 60s. Atkinson and Hansen said, CBI systems make it possible to obtain rigorous behavioral measures with the result that subject matter learning can be studied under conditions of greater control and with more precision in response recording than has ever been possible even in the psychologist's laboratory. Wow, that sounds like exactly what we need. That was a long time ago that they noted that. Are we doing it today? I would claim that we're not. So maybe we can actually do ALT, and I'll fly through this because I think you guys are already attuned to this. But computers really can keep track of 30 clocks or 26 and a half at the same time and not be compromised by it. It's not, do I teach or do I keep track of how my students are responding to my teaching? Computers can do both at the same time. Also, you have identical instruction. Now that it might be adaptive, but the equation is identical, and so the adaptivity is the same. So they might get different content, but the system is the same, which would suggest that we're taking the bias out of people getting exposed to different things. This is not a panacea, though, because we're only measuring the ALT that we're measuring while we're on the system, and then they go home and do homework, or they have interactions on the playground or whatever. All of those things are not there, but we're changing it from a variable to a constant. Engagement, still problematic. What we can say is that asymptotically, as we make software more engaging and more interactive, that it will approach ALT. You can argue engagement when the child is in there and interacting with it all of the time. It's kind of hard to say the child isn't engaged. But in any sense, it's better than our current approximations. Modern instructional systems, the ones that, was it 3.85 standard deviations, they're adaptive. They personalize. By definition, what they are doing is putting things in that zone of proximal development. And in part, they can do this because they keep detailed logs. In part, I don't think I put this up here, but they can also access other students' detailed logs. And so you can start to find out where the class is and what's been effective for other students and postulate that you could apply that to this student. You can start to imagine almost learning ecosystems, which allow for ever better adaptivity. And then there's assessment, and it's important, I think, we just heard about how difficult and expensive it is to individually assess students, and a lot of people throw up their hands and say, it needs to be individualized. Well, the way to do that is to also move the assessment over. Not just the instruction, move the assessment over. We've talked about making it non-obtrusive, making it simply built in. But in any case, it needs to be there as well. And as Supis and Zanotti pointed out in '96, if the curriculum is properly leveled in sequence and all of the items are aligned to the assessment, outcomes can be inferred from position in the curriculum. Very, very powerful. We start to have predictive things. I can start to say, this child, if I want this child to end here, they're going to need this amount of time on this curriculum based on their current learning velocity. That's a very, very powerful tool. This is not a panacea right now. CBI is not what teachers do. We talked a little bit about, will it someday be the case that a computer can teach as well as a teacher? I don't know, but today it's not there, I can guarantee you. So when I'm talking about computer-based ALT, I'm not talking about really getting at what teachers are doing in that effect. It also is more of a tutor. It's not a group learning thing. The power and the specificity of this is that it's one-on-one. And that might not apply and transfer over to a group classroom very well, but it's still powerful from the concept. There's a pace of change problem, and I wasn't sure how much to go into this, but Fletcher has pointed out in some of his other work that it might be 5 years between the time when something is measured and it actually makes it into the literature. Well, what piece of software is still in the same state as it was 5 years ago, aside from DOS or Windows? But I mean, 5 years, it's a lifetime. Who cares? By the time that comes out, if someone comes to me about Waterford research and says, well, 5 years ago your program wasn't doing X, I'm going to look at them and say, it's been 5 years, it probably does that by now. Have you redone your study with my newest version? That's a real problem. Pace of change is unbelievable, and it's very difficult to keep up with. Why are we going to make this an annual conference? Because a lot happens in 1 year. And what this leads to is a lack of external validity. So I've done a study on software from 5 years ago. You look at it and say, wow, that's very interesting, I want to replicate that. And then you do, well, you're not going to, because when you go to replicate it, you're going to use a new version of the software that's completely different. And so in the past, teachers were teachers. They didn't suddenly gain the ability to take pictures and video. They didn't suddenly gain the ability to be wireless. They were just teachers. And research on what teachers did in the 20s and what teachers did in the 80s was still relevant. That is not the case with technology. It's not relevant what we did with technology 5 years ago in terms of that precise technology, and it leads to a few issues. So finally, just a call to action. If what Carroll and Berliner were talking about was right, and I still put an if there. I mean, these are theories. They haven't been proven yet because we haven't had the tools to actually get at it. But if they're right, there is nothing more important in your studies than academic learning time. If you want to know if you're really effective, you have to measure academic learning time because it's causal. So if this is not in your study, you're missing it, according to them. We need to find out if that's right or not. For the first time, I mean, this is a bit of a message of hope. Those tools are coalescing. It's starting to come into focus. And it's my hope that some of you will join with this and try to measure this. It's difficult. If you already have software, it's not okay to just simply say time on task on the software. It's really complicated. It's complicated to figure out when to stop that clock and why, and what counts and what doesn't count, and to mash that all together. But it is doable. We've already done this with some of our software. I clearly don't have time to go into that now, as I'm over time, as Haya will tell me. But I very much want to incite action around this, because I think that this is one of those concepts, and Dexter talked about a number of them this morning, where we as a collective need to go back and do our homework and look at what's already been said, look at what's already been done, and glean from that, okay, that was successful, how can I build on that now? And I hope you'll join me in that. Thank you very much. Any questions? Do we have any time for questions? We have a couple minutes for questions.
Oh, okay. So this Waterford work program, I can't remember. Does it take account of timing, or do you have ways of taking out times like sign-on times?
Yeah, I would say that we're primitive at that level. We can do it. It's extremely manual. I started a dissertation around this, and I had a few kids coming into our community center, and I asked the programmers for a printout of each activity, and it was 12,000 entries for one student, and that can get very interesting. And you
well, it suggests the need for tools.
It suggests the need for tools. It suggests the need for meta tagging of content. You know, where Lexia that was mentioned is doing phonics and is doing this and is doing that. You have to be very careful about what is being taught, and you also have to be careful about, well, I'm explicitly teaching this, but am I implicitly teaching and reinforcing something else? And should that be added into a calculation? Warren?
I want to throw another thing into the mix. There's two types of data capture study. There's quantitative and qualitative. And you've obviously thought a lot about the quantitative, measuring and sort of trying to capture and document a child's growth and development. And I'm really interested in sort of real-time capture, sort of like the way Google Analytics on a YouTube video can tell you exactly what's gone on in the last 10 minutes. Taking that idea, I mean, what's more important than a child? Is a YouTube video more important than a child? So I asked Sergey Brin that, because maybe he'll have kids and they'll figure that out, right? But so there's that. So I think we could make some really interesting advances in real-time quantitative, and I think that's a real rich space. Second one is qualitative, and I'm holding in the Holtz pen. It sort of shocked me when I started figuring out that I've owned this pen for 2 years, and I haven't filled it up yet. It's about half, and I've been to hundreds of talks and lectures. You could kind of clip this to a kid and record every word they say in their kindergarten year and still have space left. So what if we paired that with some sort of algorithm to put it on a Dolch thing, and you could do it all automated? Man, I just find that fascinating. And sit next to this guy. I mean, this convergence that's going on is just absolutely mind-blowing. The technology and the concepts. So it's just I'm sharing because I think this is just such an interesting space.
Well, I think to that point, there was a Times article not long ago about some researchers that did that. They wired their entire house, and they then looked at vocabulary development to see how it built up for their child. And when certain words emerged, and they did a very nice graphic that you can go check out. And so people are starting to do that. Some of the difficulties inherent in that are that there's so much data. I mean, the data are overwhelming, and so there start to be questions about how can you clean it up, how can you do that. If you created a year-long recording, it would take a year to listen to it, much less catalog it. And so that's a profound and interesting question of computation.
No, I was wondering, like, if there could be like a Google Spider to go through the data automatically and say, the other technology is simultaneous translation on YouTube videos. That it's all machine based, and so
it's getting there.
Yeah,
it's getting there.
And
it's
I
very
think
exciting.
that what we need to do is be a voice for kids to say, let's harness this. These technologies are cool, but hey, this is how we can apply these technologies to make smarter decisions about how children learn.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it has to be machine based.
So to follow on Warren's point, actually I was going to say something about the second point, but you captured it. I mean, why not pin one of these things to a kid and just see what, because the data are showing that some of these disadvantaged kids hear far fewer words simply in their the first 3 years of life than kids from whatever. That aside, it may be of interest to you or may not be that DARPA is working very hard to be able to determine from facial expressions what the underlying state of the person is that they've got under observation.
In terms of engagement or
anxiety or stress or humor or a variety of things they're picking up. Now, what I'm suggesting is that DARPA, is going to throw a lot of money at these people. Why? Because they're DARPA, and they do that. So maybe if we were to identify some of these folks and get them to throw something in a brown paper bag over the fence from time to time, we might be able to apply it to children.
By the way, I'm recording this.
Oh, I'm sorry, we'll have to shoot you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We actually need to gather for Warren's talk now.
Let's stay here.